Selling no gimmicks. This is the Combat Press midweek report. It is Tuesday, December the 16th, 2014. I'm your host, Eric Reinert, broadcasting as always from the home studio. We are brought to you by the fine people at combatpress.com. Everybody go to combatpress.com for all the latest news, interviews, and opinions in the world of mixed martial arts. You can follow Combat Press on Twitter at Combat Press. You can go to Facebook. Look up Combat Press, give them a like, get all the latest from Combat Press, all up in your Facebook feed. And like I said, check out all the great content from that website. Just a fantastic group of writers. Not necessarily breaking news, but doing a whole lot of great interviews. That's really the strength, the core strength of the website. Certainly not the opinion writing of one Eric Reiner. One of the strengths of the website is our fantastic knowledge of women's mixed martial arts rankings, and the man really sitting at the helm of that, particularly that latter part, is my co-host every week here on the Midweek Report, talking about Riley Cobra Contact. Riley, how are you this evening?
Doing fantastic, man. Great to be doing the show again.
100% agreed. We got a lot to talk about tonight. We had some events go down this last weekend, talking about the Tough 20 finale. New strawweight champion crowned. We'll talk about that and a few of the other fights that we saw on Friday evening. Saturday evening, we saw UFC on Fox 13. Very exciting main event. Heavyweight showdown between Junior Dos Santos and Stipe Miocic. And again, a number of other really nice fights that we'll talk about on this episode of the Midweek Report. We'll briefly talk about World Series of Fighting 15, which also had an event this past weekend. A few events to preview. UFC Fight Night 58. Coming to us from down in Brazil. Talk about a handful of fights on the main card of that one. Then Titan FC and ONE FC both have a few events as well, so we'll touch on some of the highlights from those cards. Obviously a big news item coming to us just this past afternoon with a class action lawsuit being filed against the Ultimate Fighting Championship by one current fighter, a couple of former fighters, and I presume a number of unnamed additional fighters. We won't break that down, obviously, because neither of us are lawyers, but, we'll kind of give our thoughts on that. And then, of course, we'll wrap things up with a Wrestling Minute. Once again, check out combatpress.com for all the latest in the world of MMA, including past episodes of this show. But for this episode, let's get going talking about the Ultimate Fighter 20 finale. History-making, if you ask me. Obviously, we've got a brand new division coming through the UFC with the women's strawweight division and a new champion, Carla Esparza. Not much of a surprise, the number one seed in the Ultimate Fighter 20 tournament, winning the championship, I guess as to be expected from the number one seed. Fantastic season of the show from a competitive standpoint. Some might argue otherwise from a non-competitive outside the cage standpoint, but certainly the stuff we saw inside the cage, some of which was absolutely worthy of pay-per-view programming, and the fights technically didn't even count. So I think fans should count themselves lucky for a lot of the action that we saw on this season of The Ultimate Fighter. Of course, like I said, Carla Esparza emerging victorious and being crowned the champion that would and was crowned at the end of this season, defeating Rose Namajunas by submission for the strawweight title. So, Riley, the first question I have about Carla is, will Carla Esparza hold on to this title long-term, like, Ronda Rousey, Demetrius Johnson, John Jones, exercising that sort of dominance over her division? Or do you think her hold on the grasp is a little more tenuous than that?
It's going to be interesting to see, because obviously there's a lot of really good strawweight fighters, and not even all the best ones are in the UFC yet.
Right.
There's Invicta's got a couple of the best ones that haven't joined yet, and then there's obviously Jessica Aguilar in World Series of Fighting, who's still ranked number one despite not being with the company. But it just depends. I mean, we'd have to assume that Joanna Jędrzejczyk is going to be the number one contender of that after she beat Claudia Gadelha.
Yep.
So, and I've said it last week and I've said it before, wrestling in women's MMA is going to be dominant at this point, and that's what she's really, really good at, and that's what she showed again on Friday night. So, I think she can be long-term. I don't know if she'll be as long-term as like a John Jones or something like that, but I definitely think she's going to defend the title at least a couple times.
We'll talk about the Jędrzejczyk-Gadelha fight just a little bit later in the program, but in terms of Carla Esparza and Rose Namajunas, who do you think right now presents the greatest threat in the strawweight division to Esparza's title?
I'd say a fighter with sustainable takedown and superior striking. And honestly, at that point, I do think Adelia is the biggest stylistic matchup threat to Esparza. Unfortunately, she didn't win.
Right.
So it was a very, very close fight that she had with Jędrzejczyk. But and honestly, I thought that Joanna. We'll probably talk about that later. But I thought Joanna did win that fight very, very closely. I wouldn't have if it went either way. I would have been fine with it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought her striking was more effective than Gedalia's grappling. But it's again, wrestling's just going to be very, very key here. And there's not really a whole lot of great wrestlers in women's MMA at this point, as most of them come from striking backgrounds. So we'll have to just see. It's going to have to be someone with great takedown defense, though.
True or false? Rose Namajunas will win a UFC title.
I will say true in a few years. She's still, she did really well in the house, but we've seen guys do really well in the Ultimate Fighter house and then fizzle out. I don't think that's going to be the case with her, but I think she still has a long way to go. She's still young, so I'd say down the line, definitely I can see her wearing the UFC gold.
Charles Oliveira, also another young contender in the UFC at only 25 years of age, kind of notched another one in his belt, defeating Jeremy Stephens, the more highly ranked fighter, by decision. Provided he can continue to make weight. Obviously, Oliveira missed weight by a half pound for his fight this past weekend with Jeremy Stephens. But provided he can kind of, that can be a one-and-done type of thing. Do you think Oliveira is finally ready to break through to that sort of elite level in the featherweight division?
Yeah, it's really hard to tell with him because he has really good performances and really, really bad performances. And then if you stack on the weight issues, he's really an enigma in the division. I really like Charles Oliveira, and I kind of underestimated him going into this Jeremy Stephens bout. I put all my chips on Stephens there, and obviously he didn't perform the way he should have. With Oliveira's jiu-jitsu, we've seen him submit guys in crazy manners before, including Hatsuki Ioki, a guy that many consider to be the top grappler in the featherweight division. You got Oliveira, if he continues to keep his striking going and he continues to get the nutrition down and getting weight on successfully and safely, he really can be a threat in that division, because if you remember the Frankie Edgar fight, he gave him a run for his money in the Frankie Edgar fight, and that's the second best featherweight in the world.
Yeah, I thought that Oliveira would probably bulldoze his way through Stephens en route to like a quick victory. I didn't anticipate a decision like that. So I was obviously correct in that, but there's something about Oliveira. He's just got this sort of indescribable kind of talent that seems to be kind of buried and slowly blossoming. And I think he's just kind of coming into his own. So we'll soon see. Obviously no fight for him has been determined yet, but in the spirit of a competitive division, Riley, let's talk about 3 hypothetical matchups for Charles Oliveira. He faced Nick Lentz several years ago. That fight was ultimately ruled a draw after a point was lost. What would happen in a rematch between Oliveira and Nick Lentz?
Well, it was actually a no contest.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it was a fight that Oliveira dominated. I think it'd go the same way.
Oliveira and Dennis Bermudez.
I think Bermudez's wrestling and his grittiness is enough to pull out a win over Oliveira at this point.
And finally, Oliveira versus Dustin Poirier.
That's a close one. If Poirier could keep the fight standing, I think he wins.
All right. Does this loss kind of cement Jeremy Stephens, longtime UFC veteran, but does this kind of cement his place outside of the title picture for the rest of his UFC career?
Stranger things have happened, but, and he's still relatively young, actually, for as long as he's been in the UFC. When I think he entered the UFC when he was 19 or 20, so...
Right.
This is a guy that's still relatively young, obviously has some fight years on him, but he's training with Alliance, he's doing all the right things, so I wouldn't count him out. I'm personally a huge fan of his. I think he's got a very exciting style, and there's not many guys with the natural power that he has in his hands, so he can knock anybody out, but it's a matter of filling in the holes that he currently has right now.
Next fight I want to talk about was the first fight on the main card, Jessica Penne defeating Randa Marcos. Do you think Penne stays in the UFC at strawweight, or do you think she makes the trip back down to atomweight for Invicta?
As long as she has a spot on the UFC roster, she's going to stay there because that's where the real payday is. And I don't know why she wouldn't. She's top 10 strawweight right now, so.
I would just think that she probably the only reason I would think that she would hypothetically move back down would be for a shot at the belt, because she's probably not going to get one at strawweight until she strings together quite a handful of wins. Whereas perhaps if she dropped back down to atomweight, I could see her maybe even getting an atomweight title shot right away, or perhaps with one win. It would just take less time, but probably the payday would be less too. You've repeatedly said, and Riley, I gotta agree with you here that wrestling is the key to success in women's MMA. The other kind of wrestling-styled fighter that we saw on the show was Randa Marcos. Despite the fact that she lost to Jessica Penne. Penne is a much more experienced fighter. Marcos with only really 6 fights into her career. Do you think she'll eventually find her way into contention in the strawweight division?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, she surprised a lot of people on the show. I think that she had really good style matchups on the show, but again, like you said, and I've said, that the wrestling aspect in women's MMA at this point is just massive. You look at her fights in the house there against 2 girls that were when you match them up against people who are weak against wrestlers, but still they were ranked higher than her and were supposed to beat her.
Right.
And then she lost to Rose, which there's no shame in that. She's obviously got to work on some things herself, but you think about her only legit pro loss that's on the record, because you don't count the Ultimate Fighter fights, was to Justine Quiche, who was actually someone that I picked to make the finale coming into the season, not knowing she got injured. Because I'm really high on her skills. I think she's an incredible Muay Thai stylist, and good takedown defense, and very, very underrated submissions. So just having that one Quiche lost on her record, that's nothing to be ashamed of. I think she has a really, really good outlook, and if she continues to get better, there's no the sky's the limit for her.
I was looking at your rankings before the episode, and I didn't see Randa Marcos listed anywhere. Do you think she will now make her way into your top 10 in the strawweight division?
Yeah, so we did not include the Ultimate Fighter exhibition bouts because they're not legitimate pro fights on record. So we could not. It was kind of like being in a jury and having to disregard evidence. Okay, so that's why it wasn't. And I expect her to be in the top 15 next month.
Any other fights from Friday night that you want to talk about?
I not really. I just, the 2 that I wanted to talk about, and I published an article today on Bleacher Report with the stock report on the whole card. The scrapettes, the supposed scrapettes, the main 2 instigators were 0-2 on the night, and Angela Magana was the one that got really, really beat up for 15 minutes. So all of her talk on Twitter did absolutely nothing when she stepped in the cage. So I would not be surprised if the UFC cut her, especially because I don't even see her as a top 25 strawweight in the world.
The only reason I could see them keeping her is because she obviously knows how to sell a fight, and that's good for something. It's good for at least a couple fights if you're not totally getting dominated. So I think they probably give her 1 more, unless she does something truly stupid on.
From what I've heard from a few people, that the UFC brass doesn't like her too much. She's a pain in the ass, which doesn't surprise me because that's what I've heard from other promotions too. So.
Well, I guess we'll see what happens with Ms. Magana. Saturday night we saw one of the best, I thought, on paper cards that the UFC has put together this year, and it came to us on free television, so that was pretty cool. The headliner, of course, Junior Dos Santos defeating Stipe Miocic by decision. Pretty brutal fight. We saw kind of the same thing happen to Dos Santos against Miocic as we did against Velasquez, except just enough offense put together by Dos Santos to earn him the decision victory. So, he won, but when I think of Junior Dos Santos, at least prior to this fight, I thought, and definitely outside of his 2 losses to Cain Velasquez, he was a guy who, didn't seem to take a ton of punishment. Really knew how to put together an offense. Like I think of his fight against Roy Nelson, where he was just putting together combos on Roy Nelson. He couldn't put him away, of course, because he's Roy Nelson. But it was a very dominant performance, and that's kind of what I think about when I think about, or what I used to think about when I thought about Junior Dos Santos. Now, the sort of prevalent image in my brain anyway is sort of his post-fight press conferences where he's got the pumpkin head and he's got big mouse things happening and he's all cut up and stuff. So I guess my question to you tonight, Riley, is simple. Junior Dos Santos may have won on Saturday night, but are his best days behind him?
They really might be. I mean, I think Stipe came in with a great game plan, and I think he's really underrated, to be honest with you. But I don't think anybody expected him to do that well, and it's kind of funny we think about it. Like I talked about this with somebody fight night. I think those Cain Velasquez fights took a few years off of Junior Dos Santos' career. I mean, he really got his ass kicked in those 2 fights, and I just think that Stipe is a tough guy. It's kind of a mixture of both things, because we're so used to seeing Junior just absolutely dominating guys, but after you have so many fights, it's easier to game plan and know what he's not as good at. So I think there's a lot of factors, so it could be all sorts of things. But I mean, yeah, he didn't look great, and that he looked good but not great. I think in a loss, Stipe Miosic's stock went up further than Junior's didn't win. So
Sure. Assuming that Cain Velasquez is going to come back, healthy enough to fight Fabricio Verdum to unify the heavyweight title, or whatever that match will be, one has to assume that Junior Dos Santos' next fight, unless he does something truly surprising like retire, is probably going to be against Travis Brown. Riley, who do you pick in this one?
Dos Santos Brown?
Yeah.
I would probably go with, at this point, Travis Brown. I think that his stand-up is not as good as Junior's, but he has the ability to clinch, and he's strong and tall. And he's also rangier, so he can kind of stick and move. And like I said, I think Junior might have slowed down a little bit from those Cain fights. So I think at this point I might take Travis Brown, but it would be close.
Yeah, I think I'd have to take Brown too. I think the speed would be, the big advantage for him. Because Junior can take a punch, obviously, so that.
Oh, absolutely.
But Travis Brown has this kind of like preternaturally, quick speed on his feet for being a guy as big as he is, and so
right.
I feel like he could kind of implement a game plan where he just does damage and then gets out of range, because he's obviously longer than Junior Dos Santos is as well.
Right.
We'll see if that one gets put together. For Stipe Miocic, you got to think he's probably going to take on another guy kind of in the top 10 area of the heavyweight division. So again, like we did a few minutes ago, let's talk about a few hypothetical matchups. One I would really love to see: Stipe Miocic versus Alistair Overeem.
I think that Overeem would probably win that fight. Very close again, though. The way that if Stipe fought like he did against JDS, he could win. But I think Overeem with Greg Jackson and having a game plan is dangerous.
Miocic versus Ben Rothwell, who defeated.
I would take Miocic in that one. I think that he's got the styles make fights, and that's the stylistic fight that he'd be good at.
Yeah, talk about a speed advantage. You have to really give that to him over a guy like Rothwell.
Absolutely.
Rothwell. He's more of a power fighter.
Absolutely.
And finally, speaking of power fighters without a whole ton of speed, another fight I would really love to see: Stipe Miocic versus Mark Hunt.
I would probably take Hunt in that. One punch knockout power is just insanity, and his takedown defense has been on point. So I'd be afraid for Miocic's head in that fight.
Yeah, I guess I would have been too, but he seemed to have been able to absorb some of Dos Santos' stuff, and he's no joke in terms.
Yeah, but Hunt has the best one-punch knockout power in MMA. It's pretty scary.
Next on the UFC on Fox 13 card was the co-main event between. So Riley, tell me what you thought about that.
That was awful. Oh my God. Diaz said he was hurt going into the fight, and I believe him, because he fought like he just wasn't there. He missed weight. He had all these media distractions, all these things going on. It was just pitiful to watch, honestly. And I don't know. I took him going into the fight, and then when he missed weight, I changed my mind. I said he doesn't have his head in this fight, and I was right. He didn't have his head in the fight, and he looked like shit, and it was a horrible fight, and Dos Anjos beat the crap out of him. So.
Of course, we're talking about a lightweight contest between Rafael Dos Anjos defeating Nate Diaz by decision. I agree. Nate Diaz did not look like the caliber of fighter that we have seen him look like in the past. But to me, Dos Anjos put together a hell of a game plan and executed it perfectly. And to me, it's the best that we've ever seen out of Dos Anjos, including the knockout of Benson Henderson. Would you agree, Riley?
Can you say that one more time? I'm sorry, I was answering a text message.
No problem. Is this the best performance out of Dos Anjos that we've ever seen, regardless of how Nate Diaz looked?
No, I'd say the Benson Henderson win was bigger, just because he finished him and he did it surprisingly and quickly. So I think that was his best performance.
I liked, that one was certainly very impressive. But to me, this one was he just put together the leg kicks just basically. Totally, took Nate Diaz completely out of it.
Yeah, but it was basically, without the leg kicks, it wouldn't have been. I mean, obviously those were important. So if you say take them away, it wouldn't be the same fight. But I mean, Nate Diaz doesn't check leg kicks, and I don't know. He just kicked him a lot. It's not like he hurt him a lot with his hands. It was basically just hurting him with his feet, putting him on the mat, eventually hitting him a few times, and then that was, rinse, rather, repeat. So.
Yeah, but he was, I agree, but to me, it looked like he was about 3 or 4 more solid leg kicks from, like, the ever rare and elusive TKO by leg kick knockout because your opponent straight up can't walk anymore. He looked like he was doing that sort of damage to Nate Diaz. So, you know, I don't know. I was very impressed with Dos Anjos. It actually looks like, you know, unless Khabib Nurmagomedov, you know, makes some sort of miraculous recovery, it looks like that Dos Anjos is actually going to fight Pettis next for the title. At least that's the rumors.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
How is he different? How is Dos Anjos different from Pettis' other recent opponents?
I don't know. I just don't see him beating Pettis. He's to me, Dos Anjos is a kicking version of Gilbert Melendez minus the high level wrestling, but add in better submissions. So I don't see it going much differently.
I think it'll be a hell of an exciting fight, in my opinion, because, you know, I think, like you said, styles make fights. Both of these guys would be, you know, pretty elite grapplers, with Dos Anjos probably having the slight advantage there. But, you know, Dos Anjos has certainly improved his striking, maybe not on a level that Pettis is, but, you know, I think it's going to be a good main event whenever that comes around. On the other side of the cage, you know, Nate Diaz losing by decision. Do you think he ever fights again in the UFC?
I think he'll be gone. He doesn't want to be there. They don't really want him to be there anymore. I think they're sick of his ass. And that performance kind of just sealed it. So I think he'll be gone, and you can probably see him in Bellator in 2015.
Alistair Overeem defeated Stefan Struve by TKO, and it was not close. Overeem just put a hurting on Struve. Do you think this result says more about Overeem or about Struve?
Struve, I don't think he was. I don't know, that heart thing he had. I don't think he ever recovered. He was like, his body and his face were a different color during the fight. Like, he was like purple. I don't know what was going on with him, but, you know, it was a bad stylistic matchup for him anyways. Overeem's a power puncher, and he doesn't exactly have the greatest chin in the world. And, you know, it was just a bad matchup to him to begin with. But, I mean, again, it was just styles make fights. We said it already, and Overeem's style compared to Struve's style, it wasn't really, I don't think anybody predicted Struve to win that fight.
One person did, and he was very wrong.
Who's that?
Me.
I don't remember that.
Hey, I admit when I'm wrong because, you know, it's pretty binary. Should we consider Alistair Overeem back in the contenders conversation in the kind of talent-poor heavyweight division?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's really not a whole bunch of other than you know, Velasquez and Verdum fighting for the title, and then obviously JDS is back in it unless Kane is the champion. If JDS is fighting Verdum, he's in it, and Travis Brown is in it. Who else is there? Is even in the talks right now? I mean, not really anybody. So, yeah. And Hunt just had his chance and lost. So, you know,
Stipe just lost. So.
And Stipe just lost. So he's at least a fight or two away. So I think Overeem is in the top three in line. So.
Can Struve bounce back from two pretty brutal losses in a row, you know, separated by a very long layoff?
We'll see. I'm not 100% sure because I still don't know where he is health-wise. Like I said, he didn't look right. I don't know what it was, like the exercise, he didn't look right. But there's definitely guys he can beat in the division, especially guys in the lower half. So we'll see what happens in his next fight. The next fight will be the telltale sign if he's ready to stay or if he's ready to go.
Joanna Jędrzejczyk, we talked about this before, defeated Claudia Gadelha by split decision. Riley, you said you scored it for Jędrzejczyk. How specifically did you score this fight?
Well, the first round, I think Jędrzejczyk took it with that ending flurry at the end of the round, that last 30 seconds. You know, she let her hands go, and she actually almost finished. Gadelha got saved by the bell. I thought the second round was very close, but I gave it to Jędrzejczyk. I thought her striking was more effective than Gadelha's grappling, and I gave the third round to Gadelha. So, but the second round was disputable. You could have given it either way.
Jędrzejczyk, like we said, is probably the #1 contender to Carla Esparza's newly won belt. Can Jędrzejczyk defeat Carla Esparza?
You know, it's certainly possible. I mean, I don't think too many people thought she was going to beat Gadelha, but you know, she's a striker and Esparza is a power wrestler, so. Really not a great matchup for her to begin with, but, you know, again, anything's possible.
Finally, in the UFC's newly released women's strawweight rankings, Gadelha is ranked second, which is above all of the other Ultimate Fighter participants besides Carla Esparza, obviously with Jędrzejczyk being ranked #1. Is that correct? Would you agree with that ranking?
Yes. I think that my top 4 15ers in the world are Jessica Aguilar, Carla Esparza. Number 3 would be Joanna Jędrzejczyk, and number 4 would be Claudia Gadelha, based on resume and just background of everything she came into the UFC with.
Any other fights from Saturday night that you want to talk about?
Just Henry Cejudo, awesome performance in his UFC debut, showing he's not just a wrestler, showed awesome striking. It's against a guy who's not really known for his striking, but we'll see where he goes after that. He's talking about going back to flyweight, so we'll see what happens.
I hope he doesn't go back to flyweight,
Me neither.
because then he obviously made weight and didn't seem to have any problems, and won a unanimous decision victory over a guy who's no slouch in Dustin Kimura. So I hope he considers staying at 135. But if he can make the weight, that's the key. But you talk about wrestling being a valuable thing. He's one of the most talented American wrestlers in the last 10 years. So bright future ahead, provided he can kind of keep
him staying at 35. I like him there because he's not totally undersized. He's definitely undersized. There's no doubt about that. But he's quicker, he's more athletic, and he's more explosive than most people, despite the fact that he probably is smaller than most of those people. So I think that staying at 35 is a smart choice, but if he wants to try flyweight, it's his body and it's his career. And I think Sergio Pettis is another guy that's also talked about dropping to 25. So those two drop down there. You got two pretty big names going down the flyweight division as well.
One has to think, though, that if Cejudo does decide to drop to flyweight and misses weight again, his career in the UFC is probably going to, maybe not be over, but he's going to be on his absolute, because, he missed weight already at 125, got yanked off the card at UFC 177. So if he does it again, who knows, because he's, a drawable name, sort of, even though he's been stuck on the preliminary portion. But, I guess it's certainly a very interesting prospect to watch. World Series of Fighting 15 also took place this past weekend. The two big fights were Husimar Palhares defeating John Fitch, who we'll talk about again in a couple of minutes, for the WSOF welterweight belt, and Lance Palmer defeating Rick Glenn for the featherweight belt. Riley, thoughts on either of these two fights?
Yeah, I caught the replays, like the highlights. I'm not surprised Lance Palmer. I like Rick Glenn as a fighter, but I thought that Palmer's wrestling was going to be too much, and that's really what it came down to. And Palmer was one of my top prospects a few years ago, and he's really starting to pan out. So good for Lance Palmer. Hopefully he makes some money there and gets some fights, because a lot of people ain't happy in World Series of Fighting. And the Palhares win was awesome. I thought that was a beautiful knee bar. A lot of people thought it was a late let go, and I could see that based on his past transgressions, that how that could look like it. But I thought it looked pretty clean. You let go when the ref touches you, and he did. Obviously, he held on to it after he tapped because you have to wait for the ref. But I thought it was pretty clean play, and it just shows you how dangerous he is. And just imagine if he was still in the UFC's welterweight division. He dropped the welterweight and looked really good in the UFC, and then got booted for his holding on to the submission too long again. So and so far in the World Series of Fighting, he hasn't really had any easy fights, and he's kind of passed with flying colors. So definitely a guy that down the stretch the UFC may want to look at bringing back, because he is legit.
Well, the UFC only has the best fighters in the world, and if you're not in the UFC, you're not one of the best fighters in the world. And that's kind of something that kind of painted him into a corner with something we'll talk about in a little while. Right. Obviously, I'm using the UFC's words there. I don't actually believe that all of the whatever. You know what I'm saying. UFC Fight Night 58 features, let's see, at least one of the best fighters in the world, probably at least two. And perhaps more. Coming to us from Brazil, let's talk about a few of the main card fights coming at us on Saturday. Lightweight contest between Elias Silverio, and Rashid Magomedov. These guys have 30 fights between them and one loss, and that's a split decision for Magomedov. So obviously this is one of the more impressive showdowns between two prospects that we've seen. Obviously that's why it's on the main card of this Fight Night event coming to us on Saturday. So Riley, some thoughts on this and your pick for it?
Yeah, this is an interesting fight. Elias Silverio is really fought under the radar and done a pretty good job against some tough guys. But I'm a huge supporter of Rashid Magomedov. He was a guy that I was calling for to the UFC to sign, and when they finally did, I said this guy's going to do some good stuff. And so far he has. The split decision loss was close and controversial. and since then he's looked good. So I expect it to be a very close fight, but I do expect Magomedov to take it because I do think he's superior all around.
Right now, do you think Brazil or the Dagestan, area of Dagestan/Russia is producing better quality fighters slash prospects right now?
I'd say the Russian Caucasus, Dagestan, Chechnya. I think they're doing a much better job. I think Brazil's kind of flatlining a little bit. I think that they had so many for so long, and it kind of just, there's just so many guys out there, you don't know who the great ones are. So I had a conversation about this with Jason Coles the other day. I think that, Russia and Poland are starting to pass Brazil for who has better prospects at this point.
Talking about Brazilian prospects, we've got one fighting next on the card at light heavyweight. Antonio Carlos Jr. from the Ultimate Fighter Brazil 3 takes on Patrick Cummins, who's probably still best known for taking on Daniel Cormier on almost no notice and performing about as one would expect. That being said, Cummins has bounced back 2 straight victories in the UFC. But first, let's talk about Antonio Carlos Jr. Do you think I was looking kind of at the past seasons of the Ultimate Fighter Brazil, and no real big names pop out. Do you think Antonio Carlos Jr., still relatively young but very successful in his young career, do you think he represents the best opportunity for a tough Brazil fighter to kind of break through into fame in the UFC by and large?
I think that it would if they built him up slowly. I don't like that they gave him this fight right out of the gate. He's got a chance to be a really, really good prospect and a really good fighter in the UFC and a guy that's marketable in Brazil. He did such a great job on the Ultimate Fighter, and he's really still developing. He's a guy that needs to develop slowly, and they've given him Patrick Cummins right off the bat, a guy who is a terrible stylistic matchup for him. I didn't like this fight. I was actually hoping, you hate to say this, I was hoping somebody would get injured so that they could replace one of the other guys, and it didn't happen. And now I think it's going to be kind of shoot UFC in the foot here because they got this young, talented guy who needs slow nurturing to become a star in Brazil, and he's got this guy who is really a workhorse and under the radar because he used to be a coffee barista, and that's why we make the joke, but he's really a legit fighter. And it's just going to make Carlos Jr. look bad, and it's really a shame how that's going to happen because Pat Cummins is, I think, going to dominate this fight.
In terms of Pat Cummins' future, what do you see as his ceiling in the light heavyweight division? Obviously he's very talented, but he's kind of on the wrong side of 30. So your prospects for him.
I liked him when he came to the UFC. I obviously didn't give him a chance against Daniel Cormier, but this was a guy that I'd had my eye on and said, he has a chance to be a really good staple of the company. And since that Cormier fight, he's looked astounding. He's won a couple of fights in dominating fashion. So, I like him, and I think he still has time. Again, he's relatively young in fight years. He might be in his 30s, but he's relatively young. He's only had 6 or 7 MMA fights, and
right.
So he's in a division that's, again, light on talent. So he has a chance to be a pretty solid little light heavyweight in that division.
The co-main event I find very interesting because you've got the top ranked, besides the champion TJ Dillashaw, the top ranked bantamweight Renan Barão taking on 14th ranked Mitch Gagnon. Obviously, Lyoto Machida, very, very popular in Brazil, former light heavyweight champion and middleweight contender. But, Renan Barão is one of the better fighters that we've seen in the last 5 years. And for him to not get the main event here, I think is very telling about the popularity of the bantamweight division and about Barão specifically, at least in comparison to some of the other divisions and fighters. All that being said, Barão, still number one contender. He missed weight for his rematch against or was having weight issues and withdrew from his fight the day before he was supposed to rematch against TJ Dillashaw, obviously at UFC 177. But before that, he was about as dominant as we had seen up until his loss to Dillashaw. So if Barão wins on Saturday night, do you think he finally gets his title rematch?
I'd say no. I think Dominic Cruz is in front of him in line. And I think he'll get Dillashaw first. But, a win basically gets him a number one contenders fight, maybe against Rafael Assunção, who's still waiting in line himself. So we'll see what happens, but that would be the fight to make if Barão wins, and I think he will. I think he's all-around superior to Mitch Gagnon, who is a serviceable fighter, but this is just a way too big of a step up in competition for him at this point.
Yeah, I forgot about Dominic Cruz because he had been out of competition for so long despite his really, really impressive return. I believe that was against Teki Mizugaki.
Yep.
But yeah, forgot about Cruz, and very much looking forward to that fight with him and Dillashaw. But yeah, Barao versus Sun Sao makes for the best matchup. I would agree with you, as well as a nice rhyming scheme.
Yeah.
But if Mitch Gagnon, finish this sentence for me, if Mitch Gagnon wants to win this fight, he must blank.
Hit a home run.
And barring that, I assume then you're picking Renan Barao to emerge victorious here.
Yes, Renan Barao is the second best bantamweight in the world, possibly third now that Dominic Cruz is back. And like I said, Gagnon, as serviceable as a fighter is, and as good as and underrated as I think he is, it ain't happening.
Will Renan Barao ever recapture the UFC bantamweight belt?
It's certainly possible. He's got the skills and he's got the camp behind him. It's just a matter of making the weight and just getting shit done in the gym and getting it done in the cage.
Main event, Saturday night middleweight contest between 4th-ranked Lyoto Machida, former light heavyweight champion, as we mentioned earlier, and 10th-ranked and resurgent CB Dollaway, who has won 2 fights so far this year. Machida, like I said, held the light heavyweight belt, but he lost to Chris Weidman after dropping to middleweight. He's 36 years old, and he's got a hell of a lot of fights on his ledger. Do you think he's pretty much fighting for a paycheck at this point, or is there any way he'd get another title shot?
There's definitely a possibility he can get another title shot. He's a marketable fighter, and he's a guy that you can have in a main event pay-per-view. But he's got some work to do, and he's got some guys he's behind. So for right now, it's just a paycheck, but each paycheck leads him closer to the belt scene. And seeing that there's not a huge amount of middleweights lined up right now, there's 4 or 5 guys, he could easily find himself within a title shot's reach in a few fights.
Yeah, I mean, you've got Belfort right there. You've got Luke Rockhold. You've got who's the third guy? Obviously, Jacare Souza. If Dollaway happens to win against Machida, would he then be injected into that title conversation as well?
He would, but it's not going to happen. So I mean, he's way overrated in my book. He won a couple of decent fights against guys he should have beaten, and he's lost some fights against some guys he should have beaten. So I'm not really sold on him. I think he's getting pushed to the moon because there's not a lot of contenders in the division right now. So he got this Machida main event, and he's basically getting fed up to the Brazilian fans because they know that Machida is going to kick his head into the 5th row.
So you're saying that not only will Machida win, but we're not going to see boring decision Machida. We're going to see kick your head into the 5th row Machida.
We're going to see Dollaway does a feint for a takedown, and Machida sees the feint coming, and Machida throws a head kick that would decapitate most men.
Will we see an actual decapitation on Saturday night?
If ISIS is running a UFC show.
Whew. Rough crowd. Rough joke.
Too soon?
Other fights that you want to talk about from Saturday night UFC Fight Night 58?
Not really. I mean, it's a pretty okay card. I'm stoked to watch Yuta Sasaki take on Leandro Issa just because I love Yuta Sasaki. So, but other than that, I mean, it's kind of just a card.
Titan FC 32, another card coming to us this weekend. The heavyweight main events between Jack May and John Madsen. John Madsen, who has participated in the 10th season of The Ultimate Fighter, the all-heavyweight season, if I recall correctly. And Jack May, who was pretty high in her heavyweight prospect list, but dropped a couple of fights in the UFC when he made his way there. Any chance we see John Madsen back in the UFC with a win here? Obviously, he had a bit of a layoff, but came back with his first fight in 3 years with a victory. So again, with the sort of dearth of heavyweight talent, any chance we see him or either of these guys back in the UFC rankings anytime soon?
It's certainly possible. Madsen got cut because he was boring. He was 4-0 in the UFC, lost 1 fight and was gone, and it wasn't because he was an asshole or anything like that. It was because he wasn't an exciting fighter, and that's unfortunate for him. But obviously, an impressive win here would definitely get them calling because they do need some guys in that division, and it's definitely possible for a guy like Jack May who was beating Derek Lewis in his debut fight, and then hurt his knee and then got put over and got knocked out. And then, he had a 3-round war with Sean Jordan that I thought, he was winning the first 2 rounds before it got turned around on him. So he's obviously, he can compete with the big boys. Maybe this is his coming out party. If he can get a win over Madsen, maybe they give him another call back. You never know what happened for Walt Harris. Remember Walt Harris was 0-2 in the UFC, took a fight with Titan, won, got the call back on late notice, and now he's back in the UFC. So you can see the same scenario for Jack May if he gets a win here.
Will Jack May get a win here?
It's going to be really tough. John Madsen's a really relentless wrestler, and I think that's where May's weakness is. I think May is a very, very good kickboxer. So I think his size is definitely going to help. He's 6'7", and he's a pretty big heavyweight, and Madsen's like 6 foot even and kind of just pudgier and stuff. But again, he's a great wrestler, so it's going to be a very, very tough matchup.
Other fights from this Titan FC card, Titan FC 32, that you want to mention tonight?
Yeah, there was one. Hold on, let me pull up my stat sheet here. Rick Hahn is making his Titan FC debut after getting cut by Bellator, taking on Carlo Prater. That should be a very interesting fight. I've always been a big fan of Rick Hahn. You know, he's kind of that, Olympic judoka who really took boxing to heart and now has really, really heavy hands. So I'm really excited to see what he does with Titan, and maybe that can eventually lead him to the UFC, which, would obviously embrace him because of his Olympic past, and that's at least something they can build on with star making. So kind of excited to see how Rick Hahn does, especially against a UFC veteran like Carlo Prater.
ONE FC has its 24th event also this weekend and makes its debut in China. Highlights from this card, Riley, that you want to talk about?
There's not a lot. It's a card in China. There's not really a whole lot going on. A lot of local fighters, a lot of guys I don't know, which is hard to do because I'm pretty obsessed with this kind of stuff. The only fight I'm really looking forward to is Adrian Pang versus Vincent Latoile. Adrian Pang is an Australian guy. Shout out to Neil Rook. And I like Adrian. He's getting older, but he's definitely been one of the pioneers and one of the better fighters in Australia. So I'm kind of excited to see him get a co-main event slot on ONE FC card.
All right, lots of fights coming to us this weekend. The big piece of news, of course, coming out earlier today, was the class action lawsuit filed by a few fighters against the UFC. They claim that the UFC not only represents a monopoly, but also, and this is a new word for me, Riley, a monopsony.
What the hell is that?
A monopsony, as I had to look it up, it's where a company exercises such great control over a particular industry that they can control the price that they pay for stuff, i.e. athletes.
Walmart.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, but they're basically saying that the UFC has such a tremendous level of control in MMA that they can basically artificially deflate fighter salaries. So Riley, I've got pretty much one thought on this lawsuit, but first I'll let you chime in here.
Yeah, I followed the transgressions on Twitter. I wasn't, I was at work and I was doing some Christmas shopping and shit today, so I didn't really get a chance to like you said, when you said the monetizing or whatever the hell you said, I don't even know what that means until you just told me. But I was following on Twitter. And again, another guy I was talking to, again, Jason Coles, I think he said it best. He said exactly what I was thinking. This is former fighters with sour grapes. These are guys that are frustrated with how their career went. They're not happy where their career's at right now, and they're just taking it out on the UFC, and they're trying to find a way to spit out some extra money. And I don't like it, and I think people are going to see right through it. The guys leading the charge are Kung Lee, who obviously has been vocal about his displeasure with the UFC while with them, and we all know that's stemming from them, saying that he failed a drug test, and oh no, he didn't fail a drug test. Before that, he was totally fine. They were throwing money at him. They were giving him coaching gigs on The Ultimate Fighter China. He really has no reason to have sour grapes at all at the UFC. It's kind of embarrassing that he does. The second person is John Fitch, who's literally the face of sour grapes against the UFC, a guy who has always talked about how frustrated he is with fighter pay, and obviously doesn't get the concept of drawing a sport in which you have to draw money. It's not like contracts. You get paid like in the NBA. You get paid to play by the owners. There's only one owner. There isn't a specific owner where you can kind of test the market, and that's because it's a different type of sport. He doesn't understand that this is a sport which you have to draw money to be an attraction, and he's not because he's boring and past his prime. And then the other one's Nate Quarry, a guy who should have no place in this lawsuit because he finished his career with the UFC and retired due to injury because George Rivera beat him up so badly, and the UFC treated him well when they didn't have to treat him well. and he's joining on this lawsuit as well, and it is absolutely ridiculous. I think that this lawsuit it's gonna cause a bigger black mark to the sport, not just the UFC, but the sport of MMA, than it's going to help these people line their pockets. I don't think that their lawsuit has any kind of standing. I think everything that I've read about it is bogus and garbage to this point, and they're basically saying that the UFC is a monopoly because that's the only place to go, when they completely ignore a company like Bellator, which has the backing of Viacom, which has the deepest pockets probably of anything, even more than the UFC. They have deeper pockets, and that's I really hope that comes back to bite them in the ass, because that is 100% bullshit. Bellator is paying their fighters very well. Tito Ortiz shouldn't be sniffing six figures at this point. The fact that he's over the hill prime, and he's making he made 300 grand for that fight against Stephan Bonner where he gassed out after 2 minutes. And you're telling me that Bellator is not a place where you can go to get paid? I mean, it's ridiculous, this lawsuit. And and again, MMA is a niche sport. It's not a mainstream sport like an NFL or an NBA. You're not going to be able to get a payday like that. And again, you talk about prize fighting or boxing or MMA or whatever, which is a niche sport. You are paid based on how much you can draw. This is guys who aren't draws. These are guys that are frustrated they weren't paid as much as they think they should have been, when in fact they shouldn't even been paid that much. I don't think John Fitch deserved to even be sniffing around the six-figure mark per fight. And when he in his prime, he was making high five figures, and that's bullshit, because he was not even a draw. He was a good fighter, but he was not a draw. The only reason he drew was because he fight against George St. Pierre, and people came to watch George St. Pierre. They did not come to watch John Fitch.
I'm not going to try to turn this into an argument with you, Riley, but the only counter argument that I would have here is that in a certain capacity, there's two things that I would say. The first is that in a certain capacity, the promotion can impact how well or how poorly a fighter draws through the amount of attention that they lavish on that fighter. Yes, it's kind of like a cycle where, like, if a fighter draws, then the UFC will put more attention on them, so they will draw more, and et cetera, et cetera. But if the UFC doesn't want a particular fighter to get the sort of attention that a fighter could get, they also, I would argue, have the ability to cool that fighter's drawing power. So that would be one counter argument I'd have. The other is that while you are absolutely correct in that a fighter's ability to draw does impact their ability to the amount of money that they should make, that is not how the UFC is structuring the Reebok's sponsorship deal. It's not based on drawing power. It's based on their ranking, which is like an objective, supposedly, or at least a more objective assessment of their skills relative to the other people in their division.
Which I completely disagree with to begin with as well. I think that the fighter ranking based on how much you get paid is stupid. I think they should keep it based on drawing power, not what you're ranked in the stupid media rankings, which are usually screwed up anyways.
This issue comes up every couple of years where, like, someone will get salty about something that the UFC is doing in terms of fighter pay or in terms of benefits or whatever. And they complain, and this is obviously the furthest that we've seen it taken with a formal lawsuit. But Riley, you and I both know that there's only one way that any of this is going to change. And there's only one way, and it's the most extreme thing that the fighters could do, and that's be basically, and all of them, or enough of them, who are those draws. It can't just be like, former UFC guys or guys that are kind of toiling around the mid-card. But you need like a substantial number of drawing fighters in the UFC to say, you know what, we're not going to fight anymore until these set of stipulations are met. And I don't frankly think that's ever going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, why would they? I mean, they're making the money they should be making because they're the actual guys. They're the best in the world. I mean, and if you think about it, the lower card guys, the guys that start off the cards making $8 grand a year, they're making more than guys in boxing in their position would be making too. So I think it's absolute garbage, this lawsuit, and I don't think it will work. But I'm sorry for cutting you off. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. I disagree that they're making more than guys in boxing because they're still in the UFC, which is the premier event in mixed martial arts. They're not just like fighting for some random promoter on like some nothing card in Atlantic City or whatever. And I talked to a very briefly, I spoke with a fighter maybe a year ago at a local event here in Madison, and this guy was, I'm not going to use his name, but he was like a really prominent, like undefeated lightweight prospect coming out of our area. and he specifically said that he didn't think that he could afford to go to the UFC full time because of the amount that he would be being paid. And that's just one anecdotal story that doesn't by any means like speak to the overall evidence here. But my point is that unless the fighters are willing to go to all of the fighters, or enough of them are willing to go to an extreme measure like boycotting fighting until the UFC makes the situation more equitable for everybody in terms that whatever that means for them, nothing's going to change, because the UFC has no motivation whatsoever to do that. The UFC as a business, their main goal is to make money for themselves. If the fighters below them happen to make money, and people sort of like loosely connected with their organization happen to make money, that's a bonus. But at the end of the day, they're a business, and as a business, they're interested in maximizing their profit. So at this point, if any other promotion is saying, "Hey, UFC fighter, we'll offer to pay you X amount of money," all the UFC basically has to do is say, "Okay, a UFC fighter, we'll pay you X amount plus $1." And that's pretty much all they can do at that point, because that's the negotiating position that they have. I understand that Bellator has the pockets of Viacom, but Viacom's not going to pay exorbitantly more than the UFC would for fighters that don't, like you said, have the drawing power, because they don't have to. So the UFC, one could argue, by kind of setting a ceiling for MMA salaries, is controlling the marketplace in that way. But regardless of the arguments here, nothing's going to change unless the fighters form a union. That's as simple as that, and I don't know if that's ever going to happen. So good luck with your lawsuit and any further complaining that you have to do, fighters. But until there's some sort of collective action that takes place, nothing's going to change, because why should it?
And I've always said this, and it's really hard to say, and I know people have criticized this argument, but if you don't like the pay, go do something else. This isn't the NBA, this isn't the NFL. They don't have the revenue stream that those companies do. Everyone just expects to make this a certain amount of money, and it's just not there, and it's not going to happen. And if you're not happy with it, go get a day job, go do something else. No one's forcing you to be a mixed martial artist. No one's forcing you to be a professional UFC fighter. That's all I'm saying. I can complain about my pay all day, but it's not going to get anything done. I'm still going to work every day and earning my paycheck. And you can say, oh, well, these guys are professional athletes, they deserve this, they deserve that. Bullshit. They don't. They deserve what they signed their name on the dotted line for. Okay. I would not work if I didn't think I could live on certain wages. All right. And I can complain about my pay all the time. I probably deserve to make more than these people because my job is more important than theirs, but I do not complain about it. I go to work, I do my thing, and I come home. They need to do the same thing and stop whining. Their job is to exercise for a living and get in fights in a cage.
My only counter-argument to their, Riley, and this perhaps speaks to just sort of an overall philosophical difference between us, but there's a small group of people that's getting extremely rich off of, you say exercise and get in a cage. It's like you lose years of their lives because they're getting the shit beaten out of them on a daily basis.
Okay, well, that's their choice, though. I'm not telling them to go get the shit kicked out of them on a nightly basis. They don't have to do that. They can go get a job application like anybody else and go do something else. I'm sure, and everyone thinks that they should be a pro athlete, and then they don't ever have to do anything ever again. That's even with NFL guys. They think that they can play the sport for 8 to 10 seasons, and then they never have to work again, and when they go broke, everyone should feel bad for them. No, go to work like everybody else. If you're not making enough money, find something else that will pay you better.
And like I said, again, I think this speaks to an overall philosophical difference here. But Dana White and Lorenzo Fertitta and the people at the very top of the UFC are making exponentially more money than the people, than the vast majority of the fighters, and that's where I think, to me anyway, that's where the unfairness lies. Is that there's this much revenue.
But isn't that any promotion? Isn't that any boxing promotion? How much money did Don King make off of his fighters? How much is Bob Arum making? How much are all these guys in boxing making off these fighters?
I'm not arguing that the precedent isn't there. I'm just talking about fairness, and one's overall sense of fairness. So these guys.
Oh no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Without the fighters, the UFC doesn't exist, right?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
And so I would say, that, like I said, the main argument towards collective action here would be that the people at the top of the UFC are making exponentially more than the guys that are actually fighting in the UFC, with maybe a couple of exceptions. But I mean, like, if you know, think about, and I say this the same thing with people who complain about like football players' pay. It's like, however much the top football player is paying, the owner is making 10 times more than that per year easily. And that's probably a conservative estimate. And I believe the same is true for the UFC, that, you know, the guys at the top are making a lot more money than the guys actually doing the fighting. And I'm not saying that's like a new thing that's happening, because, you know, ownership as business, they want to collect as much money as possible. But that's where I think the main argument for hypothetical collective action would lay, not in monopoly. I mean, those are all like ancillary pieces of that. But the fact is, the people at the top of the UFC are making a ton of money, as opposed to the fighters who are making just enough money where they won't go fight somewhere else. And
there's another thing that you run into the problem. Sure, okay, so say that they succeed in getting everybody's pay bumped up. They start paying everybody more. You know what happens after that? They stop signing as many fighters, and those fighters have to go to the minor leagues and get paid less anyways. So it's really a double-edged sword, and there's no point of even arguing about it, because if a low mid-card guy is going to get a pay bump of $5,000 to $10,000 a fight, more than he would normally make, that means that they're not signing, you know, 4 or 5 guys in his place. So those 4 to 5 other guys who wouldn't have gotten a shot to begin with go back to the minor leagues and make exponentially less.
Is that different, though, than the system that's in place right now, where they're making the minimum amount of the UFC as opposed to a middling amount in a different place?
I would say that being an opening mid-card guy, making $8,000 a show, $8,000 to win, plus whatever else they give them backstage, that's probably more than any other promotion, any local promotion, and you know, probably
more than Bellator with Viacom's deep pockets.
It depends where they're at in the card. If they're a prelim guy, they're probably only making a couple grand, $2,000 to $4,000. So would you rather be on the prelims of a UFC card or a Bellator card? You know, you're gonna be making exponentially more within the UFC. And then if you're a mid card guy, you're probably making like 50. Okay, with Bellator, usually like most of the upper guys are making between 50 and 100. So. And that's only the special guys that draw. It's not. It's all about drawing. That's what the sport is. If you don't draw, you don't make the money. That's why you have guys like Conor McGregor making way more than he should be making, because he's a draw and he sells fights. You think Chael Sonnen deserved to be making as much as he did? Hell no. You know, he won some fights, but he definitely wasn't one of the best in the world. He talked his way into it. He's a showman. He knows how to sell a fight. He's a draw. The sport's about drawing. A lot of these guys that are complaining aren't draws and never will be. John Fitch is not a draw. Kung Lee is not really a draw, but kind of. Nate Quarry was never even a draw on a prelim card. People didn't tune in the prelims and be like, oh, yeah, I came to watch Nate Quarry. Like, what? I came here to watch Nasty Nate from Half Baked. I would have to watch that Nate instead of Nate Quarry fight on the prelims.
Well, those are just the 3 fighters that were named in the suit. They're representing a larger group, and I'd be curious to see who I mean, I'm sure we're not going to see any major draws, because those are the guys who are making the money right now. But
right, you know, and they have nothing to complain about because they've earned their paycheck. These other guys didn't earn their paycheck. Carlos Newton at the press conference, like, what the hell's he doing there? He willingly left the UFC and made less money in doing so.
The more money the UFC makes, and the more control they continue to exercise over fighter pay, i.e. sponsorship agreements, and basically stripping their fighters' ability to make as much money with sponsorship agreements, the more we're going to see stuff like this. So
yeah, totally. And honestly, I'm so sick of hearing about the fighter pay stuff right now. My ears are almost bleeding. It's so annoying. And again, if you don't like the pay, go do something else. I'm sick of hearing about your pay issues. You probably make more than me, and my job's more important than yours, so shut your mouths.
Whereas I think fighters should get their fair share of the take, especially when there's a whole lot of money being taken in by the top rungs of the UFC.
And again, I agree. I think that the top draws should make more. I don't think the guys on the prelim should make much more. Again, those guys aren't really attracting any viewers. Those guys are there to get better and eventually become those guys that make the big money. That's just my opinion.
Okay, well, the last thing we'll ask about this, just because I'm curious, what, in your opinion, like, let's say, what do you think is an average fighter schedule? Like, what would you say a number of fights per year for a fighter is average?
Usually in the UFC, probably 4 is the target number, assuming that someone doesn't get injured. And obviously, injuries happen. So usually they target about 3 to 4 fights a year. Champions usually two or three. But again, the champions make more money per show and make pay-per-view points and all that stuff, so they can afford to fight twice a year or something like that. So it really just depends. The lower rung guys are going to fight 4 times or so a year.
So let's say average 3.
Okay.
Because and you're talking about are you saying 8 just straight up 4 and 4 or 8 and 8?
If you're a newly signed guy, take the Ultimate Fighter finale for instance. All those girls that signed to the company on the undercard, each of them made $8,000 a show. If they won, they made an extra $8,000 to win. So a winner would walk away with 16 grand plus sponsorship money. And I'm sure the UFC, if they had a good fight, cut them another check. And I know for a fact they do that. I've talked to several fighters who have said if they have a good fight, the UFC will just cut them a check backstage. And I'm not going to name any names, but I've talked to a few of them that either are in the UFC or UFC veterans. So, it just depends if they cut you another check backstage just for having a good performance. But if you're a newbie, like the salaries that were just released today, those girls on the undercard of the Ultimate Fighter made $8 grand to show, $8 grand to win.
So let's say you go 2-1 in the UFC as a newbie. Okay. That means you make 40 grand a year just on your salary, just on your fight salary.
Right.
Given the amount that, well, I suppose because your argument is that the big draws get the big money here.
Right.
So do you think 40,000 minus all the agent fees and all that is
well, then don't forget sponsorships and stuff. I mean, sponsorships.
Right, but that's going away, man. It's going away.
That's true. And again, I don't like that either. I don't like that. I do not like the one sponsorship tree. This is a very different sport than the NFL and the NBA, and I think that having Reebok being the only company that's able to be represented is wrong. I think that they should be able to wear their own shirt. I think that the fighter wear should be Reebok. And I don't like that the sponsorships have gone away. But yeah, you're right. I think that's going to hurt lower card guys, the lack of sponsorships. But yeah, 40 grand plus any bonuses they get after the fight. And you got to figure, what do you think? About 10% of that is gone?
At least. I mean, management fees, coaches' fees, travel. The UFC doesn't pay for that. Health insurance? Well, I guess they do pay for that now.
They pay for travel. I know they pay for the travel of the fighter, and I think up to 3 corners.
Okay. Well, obviously action like this is not meant to benefit the top. It's meant to benefit the bottom. So until the top gets on board with benefiting the bottom, I don't think anything's going to change. And that's kind of the bottom line. As much as I would like to see a bit of a change, just from my own personal standpoint. I don't think that anybody's motivated enough or frankly has the courage to collectively take on the UFC in a manner that would be required to make any sort of substantive change because, like you said, if the UFC can always make new stars, right? They have the power to do that. So, yeah, this conversation is not, this isn't the last we're going to see of something like this, and it's going to continue to evolve, and it'll be interesting to see. Just as the sport continues to evolve, this is one of the elements. Just like in baseball or with the reserve clause or in football, free agency and stuff like that. I mean, think about in football, free agency didn't even come about till like the 90s. And how long was football around before that? So.
And again, and this will be the last thing I say, but if you want to make more money, find a way to make yourself more marketable. That's it. I mean, again, there's only so many spots at the top, and it's the same thing with pro wrestling. There's only so many spots at the top. The rest of the guys are not making the money that they think they should be making, when in reality they're in the spot they should be, because it's all based on how you present yourself and how you perform.
Yeah,
fans will pay to see who they want to see, and that's as simple as that.
Talking about draws and non-unionized independent contractor labor, let's have ourselves a wrestling minute, Riley. TLC was this past Sunday. I think I much rather would have watched a concert by TLC than this actual pay-per-view. I talked about it before. The first match, the ladder match between Dolph Ziggler and Luke Harper, I thought was great. I'm coming around on Dolph Ziggler because he's losing some of that kind of cutesy bullshit that used to be part of his character. Now he's just like coming out and being like non-sexy boy Shawn Michaels, in that he's just going out and working and putting on great matches consistently. propers to him. I think putting him with Luke Harper was smart because Harper is a guy who's A, developing, but B, very skilled for being a guy who's relatively new to the main event scene or the main card scene in WWE. And then finally, I thought the main event between Ambrose and Wyatt, while it was basically just a big spot fest, I guess not unlike the first match, it was very entertaining, and I thought it showcased. I feel like Ambrose and Wyatt have such a great charisma together as opponents.
Yes.
Because they're both kind of young and up and coming and really trying to show everybody really what they can do, but they're both kind of got that crazy side to them. So either one could be a face and either one could be a heel at any time, but you just put them together and it's just explosiveness. So and I guess that's an appropriate segue into talking about how that match ended with the kind of crazy television sparks into Dean Ambrose's eyes. Do you think that they're going to continue this feud with Ambrose and Wyatt, or do you think that this will put an end to it?
No, that I think they'll keep going because I think they've got something here and they need to run with it. This could turn into the second best feud of the year. Honestly, I think the feud of the year is still Ambrose and Rollins. I think that's hands down the best feud of the year. But this could easily sneak into second now that we're approaching the end of the year here. I think they should keep going with it. I think they need to stop with the hokey, crappy endings. I thought that the TV exploding his face was way too stupid and illogical. And they already had a blinding finish early on the night, which was kind of like, oh, great.
My wife pointed that out.
Oh, what the hell? Yeah, I thought the finish was dumb. I didn't see the whole match. I watched the highlights. I had a hockey game, so I only saw about half of TLC. But from what I saw, yeah, you're right. The Harper Ziggler match was, in my opinion, my favorite of the night. I thought that those two did a really good job. Oh man, did they take some hard bumps?
Yeah.
That suicide dive onto the ladder on his arm. I really did think that Luke Harper broke his wrist or something.
Yeah.
He landed so hard and obtrusively on that ladder. It looked like he broke Ziggler's nose at one point. I don't know if it was actually confirmed if he broke his nose, but he busted the bridge and the bottom of it open. It was just a stiff, old-school match, and that's why it was so good. That's what professional wrestling is supposed to be. It's not the sports entertainment crap. It's pro wrestling. It's simple storylines. It's not getting overcomplicated. Very surprised Ziggler won, and I kind of do like him winning. Because I think having the IC title on him is actually very beneficial to both him and the title. It's one of those things where it benefits both people, whereas sometimes it only benefits the title or it only benefits the holder. I think it's benefiting both guys at the same time, and I think that taking it off Harper allows him to do other things, which is good to develop himself at this point. I'm a huge fan of Luke Harper. Everyone always compares him to Bruiser Brody, and I think that's a great comparison. But the way that he's developing, I think that he can become a less gimmicky, less cartoonish version of The Undertaker based on size and ability and overall athleticism. He is incredibly athletic for a guy his size. He's also very girthy, and he does things that guys his size should not be doing. Drop kicks, hurricane ranas, suicide dives. A huge fan of Luke Harper. If you ever get a chance, go on YouTube and watch his highlight tape. I think it's like the top 50 moves of Brody Lee. Watch that. Very, very entertaining stuff. I thought, other than the massive amounts of interference in the Cena-Rollins fight, I thought it was generally entertaining, mostly because Seth Rollins always puts on a good show.
Yeah.
And when Cena's working with somebody that can also work, I think that person brings the best out of Cena because he's such a big deal. The other guy wants to put on a great show, and he always puts on a great show with Cena. So I think that Rollins and Cena had a good performance, minus the 9,000 interferences. But other than that, I did not like Eric Rowan not only getting put over by the Big Show at TLC, but at Raw the next night again. Talk about stop, start, push. A lot of people shit on the Kane Ryback chairs match, and I can understand that, but I liked how stiff it was. It reminded me like an old Attitude Era Kane match of just stiff chair shots and just some punishment, some spots that looked really, really, really rough. So I kind of enjoyed that match just based on that. I like things that look real. I don't like, watching the Divas matches where they push each other and it looks like a shoot punch, but it's not. So I kind of enjoyed that match despite the fact that so many people were not as enthralled with it. But then again, I'm a big Ryback fan, so I'm kind of biased there. I like the big guy.
Yeah, I hate to say this, but my Jets have kind of been cooled on Ryback since that CM Punk interview where he did not have nice things to say about Ryback as a performer. Did you watch NXT R Evolution?
I did not. I do not have the WWE Network, so I was not able to watch it. I did watch the highlights on YouTube. That match with Kevin Steen, I forget, what do they call him now? Kevin Owens.
Yeah.
He had his nose rearranged by a palm strike. I don't know if you saw that. That palm strike was stiff.
Yep.
And he worked through it and did some really awesome things. You know, I'm kind of excited to see where he goes. A guy his size doing stuff he probably shouldn't be because he's kind of a tub of lard. From what I saw from the Sami Zayn Adrian Neville match, that match was awesome. So, you know, and then obviously I love Kenta and Prince.
Prince Devitt.
Thank you, Prince Devitt. Again, I don't remember their what is it? Hideo Itami and
Finn Balor.
Balor, there you go. Stupid new names, but again, same old good performances and against the Ascension. I thought that was a good match as well. Good, another old school match right there.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, you're good. And I just thought it was an overall good show, and they showed up the main roster.
Yeah, Our Evolution was absolutely better than TLC, and the highlights for me were, you know, again, agree with everything you say. It was nice to see Kevin Owens and nice to see him turn heel at the very end there. Sorry if I'm giving some spoilers there, but he and Sami Zayn are going to go right into a program. His match with Adrian Neville was just good storytelling. The two highlights for me: the Lucha Dragons and the Vaudevillains. Yeah, in a fantastic tag team match. I'm really excited about Kalisto's development.
The old Samurai del Sol. Great wrestler.
And also that of the Vaudevillains as well. I think they're going to be over instantaneously if they're able to keep their gimmick when they go to the main roster, because they've sort of got that winking irony that I think a lot of fans like. Not to mention that they're both very good performers. But the match that I thought kind of stole it. Well, maybe not stole it, but certainly lived up to the rest of it, was Charlotte and Sasha Banks for the NXT Women's title.
I didn't catch that one. Heard it was good, though.
Yeah, to me, the WWE Divas division is like the UFC Heavyweight division, where there's just not that many exciting, talented people. But the same cannot be said for the NXT Women's division, and I mean that in a good way. You've got Charlotte, you've got Bayley, you've got Sasha Banks, who I think is a fantastic worker, and those three alone, when they come up onto the main roster, I think are going to make an immediate impact and are going to be kind of help a renaissance for the WWE Divas division and showcase some actually really talented performers in the ring, as opposed to and we won't name names here, but women who are clearly did not envision themselves being professional wrestlers first, rather models or actresses or singers or whatever. So very excited for the future of the WWE Women's Division. That is for sure. That's going to about do it, I think, for this episode of Combat Press. Running a little long, but passionate discussion about organized labor. That's what we're all about here on the Combat Press Midweek Report. You can check out combatpress.com for all the latest news, opinions, interviews about MMA and about organized labor. At combatpress.com, you can check out Combat Press on Twitter at Combat Press. Fire us any questions that both of you viewers have for us anytime. We'll answer them on this program. Go to Facebook, give Combat Press a like, and have all the information from Combat Press appear in your Facebook feed. You can follow me, Eric Reinert, on Twitter at ReinertEric. You can follow Riley Contek on Twitter at Big Riles MMA. Riley, our quest to 1 million followers, how close are we?
Pretty much the same place as last week. I'm not even going to give you a number.
I assume then that we are just so close to 1 million followers for Riley Contek. Everybody follow him. Follow him at Big Riles MMA, and we'll do the big giveaway. Not going to have an episode next weekend because of Christmas. We're going to come back with a special episode on Sunday, December 28th. It'll be our post-Christmas, pre-New Year's wrap-up show. Probably bring in at least one or two other people from combatpress.com to talk about Fight of the Year, Fighter of the Year, all of our big moments that we want to talk about, as well as previewing the card that is coming to us on
January 3rd.
The 3rd, and that's UFC 182. That's going to be a huge card. I look forward to previewing that. So again, no show next week, but we'll come back to you at 8:30 p.m. I'm sorry, 9:30 p.m. in the East on Sunday, December 28th for our year-end spectacular. Hopefully, Riley, you'll have 1 million followers by that point.
Yeah, I'm assuming I will, and I'll have a nice bottle of Andre Champagne to toast the new year.
Outstanding. I'm going to have several bottles of beer. That's going to do it. Like I said, for Riley Contact, I'm Eric Reinert. Check out combatpress.com for all the latest. And until next time, this has been the Combat Press Midweek Report. Thanks very much for watching, and enjoy the fights this weekend.